Hey guys, welcome back to the Wellness Diaries podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Hubbard, and today I have Michelle Yates with me, and she is someone that really specializes with helping women with binge eating, emotional eating, overcoming all or nothing mindset tendencies. And she has a master's in health psychology. She specializes in eating disorders and disordered eating. She's worked in hospitals, outpatient eating disorder treatment, and is now coaching women online to overcome things like binge eating, emotional eating, all or nothing, and getting off of the diet roller coaster. So, thank you so much, Michelle, for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for asking me. I love doing this. I have my own show, so it's kind of nice to just like flip roles and be a guest for a little bit.
Yeah, it's less stressful that way, isn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
So tell everyone just kind of how you got started in this career, your history, and what led you to having this be kind of like your niche.
Yeah. So I used to have a really toxic relationship with food. I was like your standard um teenage girl that was a dancer and struggled with body image, but it was all very low key. Like if you asked any of my friends or family, they wouldn't know that I was going through any of the things I was going through. I was really good at hiding it, but behind the scenes and kind of under the hood, I was constantly trying to figure out ways that I could get skinnier and, just like that skinny ideal. I'm very short. I'm only 5'1" on a good day, depending on what you're measuring with. And so, if somebody like me goes and looks at the ideal body weight chart, then it's like, oh, I'm only supposed to be. And of course, like me, I would look at the lowest range because it gives you a range. And I'm like, oh, I should be down in like the 90s. So then it just like started to become this obsession of mine to get smaller. And because there was that ideal body weight chart range, I felt like what I was doing was healthy because I was trying to stay healthy with based on these medical charts. And of course, now that I actually have like training in health and medical sciences, like I understand more like about that. But at the time as a teenager, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna start cutting calories, and you just look up all this information and get all of your diet tips from. For me, it was like a little bit of magazines, a little bit of online, a little bit of friends. Like magazines were still kind of a thing when I was a teenager. So it was a mix of all the medias. And of course, like all the advice I got was just total crap. So yeah, was like restricting my calories a lot and tracking everything. And it just became too obsessive for me. And I want to say, I know there are people that can track their calories and it not affect them the way that it affected me. So I don't mean to suggest that calorie tracking is always a bad thing or self-monitoring is always a bad thing. It's just that for me personally, it put, and my perfectionistic tendencies, it put me in a bad place. And then, I was doing that long enough where I couldn't keep up with it. I mean, most people can't keep up with eating less than 1,000 calories a day. And yeah, eventually it was around college when you have, which is normal, when you have a big shift in your life circumstances and uh, stress and stuff, I started overeating and I found myself binging for the first time in my college dorm room, like shortly after my parents dropped me off. And that was just the most bizarre experience because it feel like for anybody that's gone through it, you know what I'm talking about. It's very like out of body and you feel like you can't stop. And then what you're left with is just guilt and shame and like, what have I done? And then you're starting to rack your brain to figure out how you can fix it or make up for it. So yeah, I went through periods of over exercising, over restriction, binging, emotional eating, purging. I mean, you name it, I've done it. And so I get it. And I know how much it can suck the life out of you. And the kind of come to Jesus part of my story is that I am a dietitian and obviously, I went to school for that. And when I was going through my education, I found that to actually be very healing for me to get educated on what actually matters when it comes to nutrition. Because reality check is that 95% of the things that I thought about nutrition were either not true or they didn't matter nearly as much as I was giving them credit for. And so it helped me to relax more with food and nutrition and start to take into account, like, oh, actually my mental health is deteriorating as I try to pursue this like unrealistic physical health, and I should blend those together. Like, I don't want to elevate one at the cost of the other one, you know. So yeah, I started to get really interested in, well, actually I'd always been interested in eating disorders, but really got interested in it more in college. And especially as I looked more into like intuitive eating and healing your relationship with food, it was just like, oh wow, this is, I don't know, like I needed to hear a lot of the things that the anti-diet side had to say. Do I agree with everything now? No, but it's very healing to be like, okay, the size of my body is not the most important thing in the world.
Yeah.
And there's more to life. So, yeah, does that answer your question? I didn't really get much into my career, but I
No,
don't
that
know.
was great. And I also loved that you put that little note in there about how self-monitoring, like it doesn't just because it doesn't work for some people doesn't mean that it's bad for everyone. And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the in the coaching realm where there's coaches, there's dietitians, there's PhDs, there's people that on paper have a lot of credentials, and then there's some that don't. And I think we can all get in this war sometimes of like, no, macros is the best way. No, intuitive
Hmm.
eating is the best way. And no, this is the
Yeah.
best way. But it's the same thing that we tell clients with nutrition. Not one way of doing something is going to fit your lifestyle like it might fit someone else's. And so
Yeah.
just having that nuance, I think, is really important. And then I
Yeah.
also wanted to say, when you were going through school, you said that you were always interested in eating disorders. When you were struggling, were you like in school at this time, kind of in denial about it? Or
That's a good
how did
question.
that go?
The struggles started at a really young age and just kind of like, you know, snowballed effect. And then when I was in college, I think there was a little bit of denial, but it was like I was in an elective. It wasn't even a core curriculum class, which I think is an issue, but it was an elective on eating disorders. Um, my gripe about that is I just feel like everybody should have education on the topic. But anyway, I digress. And I was reading through criteria and I was like, oh, it's weird. That kind of sounds like me, but I don't meet it 100%, you know, like I don't fully check all the boxes. So I'm just, so there, you know, there's the denial, there's the justification. And so, yeah, like I had disordered eating for sure. I'm sure depending on when you talk to me, like if a professional was to talk to me and try and diagnose me, I probably could have met criteria for anorexia at some point. But then again, there's that interesting element where I am small, so I never was like underweight, even though I was severely under eating. So there, I don't know that I would have gotten that diagnosis actually, but it didn't really matter. I didn't need it. I knew that I was struggling at some point, and I don't know. I think it was a combination of like going through that class, also just being around people who did have a good relationship with food that I respected, like my professors and my classmates. Not that I don't respect other people in my life, but just like because of their position in the nutrition world and the health space, you know, like that was a part of my life that if I respected people that were also in that part of my life and they had a healthy relationship with food and they weren't constantly worried about calories or what a food was cooked in out at a Mexican restaurant or whatever, I'm like, oh, maybe I don't need to worry about it as much as I thought. So, yeah, like there was definitely some denial. And I think I never really in the moment knew how bad things were. It's always like hindsight's 2020. You know, you could connect the dots in reverse in the rearview mirror, but not in the future. So, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned like not being technically underweight. And do you think that people that are struggling refrain from either getting help or thinking they deserve help because they're not on their deathbed struggling?
1,000%. 1,000%. It happens all the time. And you could say that in either direction. Somebody who is underfeeding and someone who's overfeeding and is more of like a binge eater or emotional overeating or eater, and that's how their disordered eating manifests. Um, because yeah, like I think the issue that we can fall victim to is waiting until things are bad enough to get help. And for me, that was a pride thing. I just felt like I had it all together, and I was in school to be a dietitian. I know what I'm doing. Even though I didn't, because I wasn't like, I didn't have my degree yet. I don't know. Like, it was just, I was a prideful kid. So, um, and I think that we all have that tendency to just think that we've got this. It's not as bad as we think it is. We can pull it together. I don't need help. Um, so yeah, and unfortunately, that can be the detriment of a lot of people to wait.
Yeah, do you think that you felt ever scared to talk about it or ashamed to talk about it because you were in school for that? Like it would almost discredit you or something?
Yeah, I think so. Even to the point where I just like didn't even process it, you know? Like it for me, it was better to just not think about it and not have to deal with it and just move on to the next thing. So, I don't know. I think it's just I'm pretty good at the time, I was really good at dissociating and being like, nah, this isn't an issue.
Yeah, hey, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Dr. Jennifer Gaudiani?
I don't think so.
Have you heard of the book Sick Enough?
Mm-mm. Maybe.
You should read it. She's a doctor that works in eating disorder treatment centers, and her whole book was around the fact that like there's so many people that feel like they're not sick enough to get help with eating disorders. And it was really interesting to read. I actually read it when I was recovering from hypothalamic amenorrhea
Yeah.
because I was struggling with a lot of the things that people with eating disorders were struggling with. And I found a lot of interesting things in the book because I like to consume information and just learn about things. And I just thought it was a really, really interesting book. And so if anyone out there is interested in reading that, I think that you should.
It's good to know. I'll have to put it on my list.
Yeah. But it's funny that you mentioned that you tended to avoid all of those feelings and suppress it a little bit. Do you think that for a lot of people that can manifest itself into binge eating disorder?
I think so. Yeah. I think just a lack of digging into the issues that are truly at hand. Like for me, I had a lot of internalized pressure to look a certain way, to weigh a certain weight, and never addressing those things became disordered eating, and then also like all the messages we get about having a healthy diet and stuff. And because of the avoidance, the disordered eating, like if you never really heal the core issues, it can look different throughout your life. So, like for my story, for example, it was like really restrictive for a while, and then it became more of a binging and overeating type of thing, which involved purging too, because I was trying to compensate for the overconsumption. And so, for some people that develop binge eating disorder, I've actually worked with a lot of women who they come to me with a case that looks more like binge eating disorder, but they had a history of anorexia. And it's like, well, the core issues aren't any different. You still feel a certain way around the topic of body image, your body in particular, and food. And so I think with binge eating disorder, I mean, it's complicated, but there can be when you're avoiding things, we can then start to try and cope with things that we aren't dealing with in unhealthy ways, like with food. You know, if you feel negative things, you want to make that feeling go away. So we turn to food in some cases. And um, certainly that can be happening with binge eating disorder.
Yeah. So what are some common signs and symptoms of binge eating disorder, and how can we differentiate that from just overeating?
hmm So, binge eating disorder, there's the diagnosis of binge eating disorder, and then there's the symptom. So, if the symptom is occurring enough and it looks, or I guess like there's enough criteria being met, then you can get the diagnosis. So, I'll kind of talk about both because some people experience binge eating without having binge eating disorder. So, binge eating as a symptom is eating an amount that is definitely larger than somebody else would in that same circumstance in a short amount of time, which is usually about 2 hours or less, and feeling a loss of control as well. So I think that's an important point to remember. There's a couple things actually that I want to tease out with that. A lot of times we think that we've binged when it's actually maybe what you ate is generally a really normal amount of food for somebody else. But you think you've binged because your threshold of how much you think you should eat is a lot lower than either what it should be or just the reality or what somebody else's could be. So if you're just having like a second helping of food, that's not necessarily a binge. A binge would be more like you've had a second helping and then you went back into the fridge and you got, or the freezer, and you got a whole pint of ice cream, and then you went and got a bag of chips, and you're getting like more food than anybody would eat in that circumstance. But at the same time, that can be tricky still because what I would normally eat is very different from what like a 6'5" football player would eat. So even that is like not the best definition, but it's the best we've got right now. Um, so that's something to consider is this quote unquote normal? Could you see somebody else eating that amount of food? But don't think about it too hard because you could probably come up with a situation where it was acceptable. Um, and then the same circumstance too is important to think about because everybody's going to binge on Thanksgiving, you know, not everybody, but that's the normal, you know, in the US or Thanksgiving is, or even the Super Bowl, you know, like it, that's kind of the thing is that it's focused on food and eating a lot of food. And so I wouldn't say that somebody that ate a lot on Thanksgiving is struggling with binging, you know, like that's an isolated event. It's very common at that time of the year. And on that day specifically. And then the last thing too is feeling a loss of control. This is a little bit murky too, because some people plan their binges. But I think if you walk away from feeling an immense amount of guilt or shame around what you've eaten and how much you've eaten, and you feel like even though cognitively you know you shouldn't do that, but somehow you can't get yourself to stop, whether it's planning in advance and making it happen or just in the moment it happens, then that would be like more reminiscent of binging. So then binge eating disorder is just when that's happening frequently enough. I think there's different severity levels, but if I remember correctly, I think the minimum, and I, by the way, I'm not qualified to diagnose disorders, but just from reading materials, I think it's like once a week for, is it 1 month, maybe 3 months? Is like your minimum threshold for, okay, we've got a disorder going on that you may get from a practitioner, a diagnosis from a practitioner. But yeah, I mean, to the point that we made earlier, I don't want anybody to think, oh, because it's not happening frequently enough, I don't need to worry about it, you know, or because it's not definitely more than somebody else would eat at that same time, then I don't need to worry about it. You know, like if it's distressing to you, then you need to worry about it. You need
Right.
to figure it out.
Right. Right. Like if it's drawing concern and you're wishing that you didn't do it as frequently, that would be, time to talk to someone about it for sure.
Yeah.
But could you share some common triggers for people, whether it be binge eating, emotional eating, and how they can work to identify those and address them themselves?
Yeah. I think it's a good question. I think the biggest example that I see or like scenario that I see is somebody that binges at night. And usually when I dig into situations like that, and I ask them like, well, let's, reverse engineer a little bit. What did your day look like? And a lot of times it'll be like, well, I had some eggs for breakfast or a protein shake, and then I had a salad for lunch, and then I got really hungry around 2, so I tried to just like have an apple, and then by the time I got home from work, or I put the kids down to bed, if it's a stay-at-home mom, I just couldn't stop and like started to eat and couldn't stop and ended up binging. And so in a situation like that, like I feel like that's pretty obvious, but a lot of people don't. It's a case of like, okay, you're just not eating enough, like you're starving by the end of the day. That's not because you have this terrible self-control or willpower or you're broken or you're addicted to food. It's like you're a human and humans have needs. They need food, you know, and everybody has a certain amount of food that they need during the day to just meet their minimum requirements of functioning. And so you better believe that your body is going to be asking for those needs to be met if they haven't been by the end of the day. So that's a big thing, is just like really empowering people to understand their bodies more and um, their energy needs more. I don't know that it's necessary to sit there and like calculate your calories if you don't feel the need to do that, but at least to understand the different categories of how you burn energy, because a lot of people don't understand that even if they laid in bed all day, they would still need to eat to make up for the energy burned. There's just like this idea, I think, that unless you exercise, you're not burning energy or something, you know? So that's a big one, is just people not eating enough and then it triggering them to binge because there's just this physical restriction or physical need that needs to be met. On the other hand, there can be emotional needs that need to be met. And we use food as a way to try and meet them. For example, I'll use a similar scenario. Maybe somebody struggles with binging at night, but they actually eat really decently throughout the day. Really balanced meals. They've got consistent intake of nutrition. Like objectively, they're meeting their needs. But yet they still struggle with binging. So there could be still an unmet need, but in this case, it's more psychological or emotional. And there could be um, a restriction in the sense of just psychological restriction where it's like, oh, I shouldn't eat those foods or even can't, or um, it's not a good idea for me to have like this bucket of foods, whatever that is, usually like ultra processed foods or something. And so because of that, we feel this like urge to want them even more because now it's an off limits thing. We're kind of like children in that way. Like we want what we can't have. We don't really ever grow out of that.
Yeah.
I've, and so that can be, in a way, that's an unmet need because it's like a desire to break a rule or something. And then on the other hand, you could just be really stressed out. You need to feel comforted. You need to feel relaxed. You need to feel something, or you need to feel like you're accomplishing something. I think something that surprises a lot of women is when they figure out that binging for them has been a method of feeling accomplished. Because, especially for somebody who's a stay at home mom with like little kids, speaking from experience, it's really easy to feel like you didn't accomplish anything throughout the day when all you've done is just parent these tiny humans and you're like playing with blocks and giving them snacks, what feels like 1,000 times throughout the day, and then cleaning up the snacks and like reading these ridiculous children's books or playing on the floor, even though you can like zoom out and be like, okay, I've done a lot today. I've kept humans alive. I've loved my children. I've given them a safe space to be in. I've fed them. Even though you can probably objectively say that, it still doesn't feel like you've done a lot because you haven't done anything to mentally stimulate you. You've been working on other people, not on yourself. So sometimes binging turns into this avenue of caring for ourselves. So that's why self-care is like one of the first things that I bring up with my clients who tell me that they like stress eat or that they um, emotionally eat is like, hey, how's your self-care going? Because if you're not taking care of yourself, it's really easy for you to turn to food to try and take care of yourself. It was a really long answer. I feel like I've been talking for an hour. I'm going to stop. What follow-up questions do you
No,
have?
I love that, but that's a good I guess segue because you talked a little bit about self-care and I think we can tie in a little bit of mindset and mindfulness into that as well. So what do you work on with clients in terms of their mindset, mindfulness, awareness when it comes to being more in tune with their emotions? I know we kind of touched on triggers, but that was more so for binge eating, but being mindful of what we're choosing, because sometimes I think we can kind of clump emotional and mindless and like there's all different types of emotional eating too. So I guess
Mhm.
I don't know if that question even is coherent enough to answer, but kind of a conglomeration of all of that.
You want me to start with like how emotional eating is maybe different from binging or overeating or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So emotional eating, it can certainly turn into a binge because like back to what I said just a few minutes ago, binging can be the result of a unmet need. And so emotional eating can begin as we're trying to meet our needs to feel comfort or satisfaction or stimulation or whatever it is. And actually to your point, Ashley, I think you're kind of getting at this, the sometimes people instead of emotional eating, they emotionally restrict because they have a need to feel accomplished or satisfied or like approval or whatever. And so our method of feeling that can shift from eating to refraining from eating. So I think that's important to note too, is that emotional eating can also look like emotional restriction. You're not eating because you want to feel accomplished. And to you, refraining from getting calories in or getting below your calorie mark for the day or whatever it is makes you feel accomplished. So, or it tries to fulfill this need to feel approval from others. So you're using food to try and change your body to get that approval, you know. So there's all kinds of ways that it can manifest. But um, yeah, emotional eating is like there's not really, as far as I know, there's not a technical definition of it, but I think when we're talking about emotional eating, we typically mean somebody turning to food to handle an emotion that is unpleasant and that they don't want to feel, like stress, anxiety, boredom. Like I know you mentioned mindless eating. Like, yeah, I would say mindless eating in some ways is like kind of an emotional thing because you're bored or trying to it can even be like an anxiety type thing, you know, where you're just like it's hard to be still. And so food helps you feel like you're not still, you're not in the quiet. Um, and some would say maybe that's mindless too, you know. So yeah, it's there's all kinds of emotions that go into it, you know. And then at some point it can turn into a binge because maybe what started out as a need to feel comfort, you end up losing control and eating an amount that's larger than anybody else would in that circumstance in a small amount of time. So, yeah, I don't know if that gives you what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I've never heard the emotional, like non-eating. I've
Yeah,
never heard it talked about that way, but that actually makes a lot of sense. Just with feeling that accomplishment of holding off, as
right.
long as you can at least from eating
Yeah,
anything.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
but when we talk about being more in tune and listening to our bodies, when you're working with clients to overcome either binge eating disorder, or emotional eating, I know you do a lot of work with intuitive eating. So, can we talk about first the principles of intuitive eating? Because I think it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and a lot of people don't realize the actual principles of it. So, can you talk first about the principles of it and how it differs from a traditional dieting approach?
Definitely. Yeah, intuitive eating, typically people think that just means to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. And that's definitely a part of it, is being aware of eating when you're hungry, or I'm sorry, when you feel hunger and then when you feel fullness. And sometimes people don't even know how to identify those feelings because they've been dieting for so long or restricting for so long or fasting that the feelings of hunger just don't really present because your body is just like, well, I'm not going to send these chemicals around because what's the point? They don't get honored, you know? Um, so that can be a difficult part for people to kind of get on board with intuitive eating, is if they just don't even feel those things in the first place, which is why it's important to work with somebody who's experienced in that to help you get those signals back. Um, and just eating regularly can really help with that. And then on top of that, though, that's not what intuitive eating is. Like, that's an element of it, but specifically or technically, intuitive eating is a self care eating framework. It's supposed to help you with tuning more into your needs, not just in the sense of are you hungry or are you full, but instead, like, what are your emotional needs? What are your physical needs? And what are your practical needs? Maybe, like, I was just having a conversation with a client today who is, she's in her, I think she's at her graduate program, and she's in the operating room like all day right now for her clinical rotations. And I've also worked with a neurosurgeon who I had a similar conversation with, where they're like in surgery for 8 hours or something. It's like you can't just eat when you're hungry in that circumstance because you're in the middle of like cutting someone open. Um, and surgery aside, many people struggle with being able to truly honor their hunger when they feel it because of their job. They're in the middle of something. They can't eat until they have a break. So some people would feel like, oh, I'm not intuitive eating correctly if I can't eat when I'm hungry. But that, again, like, there's so much more to it than just eating when you're hungry. There's also a practical side to it. I think that sometimes when you see people talk about intuitive eating online, it seems very like nebulous and like you'll just feel it and it'll just come naturally. But it's like a lot of times that is, like, in my experience, that is not at all what it's like for women that are learning. There is very much so an element of logic and strategy and practicality at play, at least when I work with women. I can't speak for other people that teach intuitive eating, but for me, like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of practicality here. We need to make sure that you're eating enough and you're eating a good balance of nutrients to help prevent those binges if you struggle with binging, or just make sure you're getting enough food in general, no matter who you are. Um, so yeah, there's technically 10 principles total that cover a variety of things, like um, trying to come away from like this diet culture and diet mentality and skinny culture, and then going through like the hunger and the fullness and the emotions. And yeah, it's a whole framework, and I think a lot of times people just like to pull out little pieces of it and be like, this is intuitive eating, and it's like, no, you're missing everything else. And so it gets misrepresented. But To that point too, like I do want to acknowledge that there's pieces of it that I don't fully agree with either. Like I definitely use what I feel like is evidence-based and helpful for my clients, and then I'm not like a diehard, like I will take 100% of all the intuitive eating materials and apply it because yeah, I hesitate to say I'm an intuitive eating dietitian because I don't take all of the things and apply them. I think that there's some misleading things about it at times that aren't ultimately helpful. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that or do you commonly see women struggle with the finish your plate sort of situation where they have trouble with ordering out and stopping and being like, okay, I'm good. Like I can just take leftovers.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big thing a lot of times is that like feels like a habit to them of just finishing their plate. A lot of times that's like I feel like a lot of times in those circumstances, it's an issue of what happened in their childhood, whether they were told to always finish their plate or they were told to eat a certain thing in order to get a certain thing, like eat your vegetables and then you'll get dessert. Or it can also just be like a food insecurity thing that they grew up poor, or their family couldn't afford a lot of food, or they just didn't know if they were gonna get their next meal, or when they would get their next meal. And then also too, scarcity in the sense of their mom was always on a diet. And so whatever mom was eating, they were eating. And so they were basically on a diet too. Or they had siblings that would get all the food right away, and then you're like left with nothing, and so you'd have to eat quickly just to be able to eat, period, because other people in the house would get all the food before you. So a lot of times when somebody's struggling with a finish your plate mentality, that's kind of underneath of it, and you kind of have to work through like, okay, you're an adult now. You are in charge. You are safe. You can eat slowly. you know, we got to work through those things.
Yeah, I love that. So when it comes to, being more mindful, honoring our hunger fullness, just being more aware of those things, how do you help women that have throughout most of their lives they spend ignoring kind of the trust and the, I guess, intuitive cues that we have, we tend to just like ignore them. Oh, I'm hungry, I can push it off. So how do you help them rebuild trust with their bodies and help them
Mhm.
learn to listen to whether it be hunger and fullness or just like any other sort of cue that they might have?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there is that we need to cultivate the skill of like awareness and curiosity, because if you don't have any awareness around how you're feeling physically or mentally or your situation or triggers or anything, then it's like impossible to ever get these skills um, in a place where you can listen to yourself and trust yourself and all of that. Like that awareness piece is so critical. And it's like, it's funny because when I work with women, um, pretty often somebody will be like, is it normal to be like hyper aware about everything in your life when you're going through this process? And I'm like, yeah, that's a good thing. That means that we are sharpening that tool, and that makes me happy. So it's interesting how it's not just about, or that particular tool doesn't just affect your relationship with food. It also can help you in a lot of different areas of your life. Um, but it's important that we do sharpen that tool. Otherwise, how are you going to know if you feel hunger? How are you going to know if you feel fullness? Even if we're doing the right things strategically to get there, if you're way too busy all the time and you never slow down and you never check in with yourself to ask, how am I doing? How am I feeling? Let me take a couple deep breaths here and just slow down, then it's going to be incredibly difficult to ever get to a place where you automatically notice those things if you don't take the time to consciously notice those things, which is the goal. I don't think it's necessary to be like hyper aware all the time. I mean, it's a skill that, like anything, in the beginning, it takes a lot of effort to learn how to do it. And then it becomes more automatic and subconscious. So that's, I mean, that's really so important, is just that curiosity. And even to the point of being curious about things that didn't go well. Why did it not go well? What do I think contributed to that? Um, why do I feel so guilty about it? When it's just like asking yourself why as many times as you possibly can without going crazy.
Yeah, and something that I think doesn't help us in our society is that we're just always distracted, and there's things that are kind of always at our fingertips. We're always busy. We're trying to, stimulate our brains with social media
Mm.
and again, doing those things is just keeping us from feeling and pausing. And I noticed a lot of times too, I was talking with another guy about emotional eating, and he works with a lot of super busy women that have like crazy jobs, like surgeons and
Mhm.
like all of this stuff, like you were saying, and they just never have a time for themselves. And
Yeah,
so it's like that eating at night almost becomes, it's like that's their sacred time to
totally.
either feel comforted, to feel like they're still doing something because they're being stimulated by food. That
Yeah,
could be a whole nother rabbit hole of like, you know, stimulation, like dopamine, things like that, that
yeah,
may not be emotionally technically driven, but like you're seeking stimulation from something. Um,
yes.
so so yeah, I mean, I just think that we have this culture of go, 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 and that works
Mhm.
against us when it comes to being more self-aware of what we're actually feeling.
It's so true. And that's also, you bring up a really interesting thing that can happen is like when we take away that sacred time, then what? And that can be another barrier to overcoming binging or emotional eating patterns, is that we don't know how to replace it with something that still makes us feel comfort or feel stimulated. And so that's where, again, like the willpower and the self control is just really not that helpful, because that's not what you need in the moment. What you needed was to feel comforted, or to feel like, my gosh, I'm finally doing something for myself today. So if you just take something away that made you used to feel that way, um, you can miss it and want to go back to it. And if you don't give yourself something else that makes you not miss that thing as much anymore, then you're kind of inevitably going to go back to it.
Right, like reminding yourself that this serves a purpose and it's not that you are bad for doing it. It's like the reason you're doing it is because it's doing something positive for you.
Yeah.
But to a certain point, if you're trying to fix it, then clearly the negatives might be outweighing the positives. But like you said, trying to find something that can replace it, um, is really important. So like
Mhm.
what are some examples of self-care activities, or maybe not even self-care, maybe it's like a hobby, which I guess would be
Mhm.
self-care, but just something else that you've noticed with your clients that has helped.
Yeah, well, yeah, it depends on what they're needing. Like, do they need to feel stimulated? Then maybe we should do something that's more like a hobby, where you're going out, like you're on a volleyball league, or excuse me, or you're like working on some sort of project, or like non work, or like some sort of different part of the brain than what you've been doing all day. Like if you're used to taking care of kids all day because you have your own, then babysitting for something else isn't necessarily going to give you the stimulation you're looking for. It's going to need to be something that is a different part of your brain, and makes you feel like you're taking a break. So, yeah, like that, any type of hobby can be really helpful for that. Or even just like, I've had clients that find that listening to podcasts really does it for them in terms of feeling stimulated, because they just feel like they're learning, or they're growing as a person. Like sometimes you just want to feel like, especially for people that have like an advanced degree or something, where they're really used to being in a learning environment, and then because they've earned the degree they were working for, because they're just not working anymore or whatever it is, they miss feeling like, I'm learning something, I'm being challenged, I'm growing. Again, I'm just thinking of a mom example because I work with a lot of moms. And so then something like podcasting, or just like taking a class, some type of self development thing can be really helpful for them. But then you've got people who maybe are the busy professional and they don't need to feel stimulated, they need to feel relaxed. And so things like taking a bath at the end of the night, having a book that you really like to catch up with, or stretching, or doing like even again the physical activity, whether it's like a organized sport or just exercise or yoga or whatever, can be helpful, because if you've been using your brain all day, it can be really restful to switch that off and just use your body and like do something physically involved instead of mentally involved. So that can make people feel rested or comforted, or um, yeah, like they've got a break. So those are examples off the top of my head, just fresh on my mind.
Yeah, those are all really good. And something that you work a lot with women on too is their mindset, whether it's like all or nothing, like perfectionist tendencies. And
Hmm.
that definitely has uh it trickles into a lot of food and fitness and all of that. And so what I wanted to ask you was, do you see often with your clients and in general how this all or nothing thinking can turn into binge eating, where someone is like,
Hmm.
I had this today, so I may as well just eat the whole box or eat the whatever else. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays a role into all of this as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like most of my clients probably have this to some extent going on. Yeah, I mean, it's like I think you did a good job of describing what can happen is, well, I've already broken, quote unquote, the diet, or gone over the limit, or had that food that I wasn't supposed to have, or that I know I shouldn't have. So I might as well just like enjoy it while it lasts, and like soak this up, because I'm gonna have to start again tomorrow. You know, like that is such a pit of despair is when somebody falls down the hole of, well, tomorrow's, I'll just start over tomorrow, or day one tomorrow, or Monday, whenever it is. And so then you just get into this like last supper mentality of like, well, I'm just gonna have all the things because tomorrow I won't be able to have them again. So enjoy it while it lasts. And the problem with that is that you can decide to have a day one the next day, or like I'm sorry, what I mean is like the next day could come around and then you fall off the wagon, so to speak, again. And so then, well, Tuesday's going to be my day one, or Wednesday is going to be my day one. And so it's just this perpetual like self-indulgent cycle that will, and like, maybe get better. Maybe there will be a day where you magically have like all the self-control and willpower in the world. And so I think what's really important for women to realize is that that cycle is just going to continue. Like, what are you waiting for that to stop? When do you think this is going to finally stick? This whole day one thing is going to finally stick. And so the I think where it's really important to shift our focus to is grace, and like, hey, well, and also expectations. Like, what expectations are you putting on yourself? Because if you're expecting to have the perfect diet, you're never going to meet that expectation. And you're always going to have a day that didn't go as planned, that you're going to feel like you need to start over again. So if you put that on yourself, it's like you're going to be stuck in this cycle forever, because there is no perfect diet. Um, and then maybe it's not that. Maybe it's like, well, I just need to never have sweets. Okay, well, what are you going to do when it's like somebody's birthday, or it's your birthday, or you're at an event that has really delicious looking cake or cookies? Like, do you really expect yourself to never have a sweet for the rest of your life? So then when they inevitably do, triggers that mentality again. So it's important to adjust your expectations for yourself. Make them realistic. If you're somebody that struggles with perfectionism, don't strive for perfection in the sense of being getting the A plus grade. You know, I think perfectionism is a really good quality to have in a lot of ways. It can be a really big strength and it makes you a really powerful person in a lot of ways, but it can also be your biggest downfall. So adjust the uh, expectation of being perfect at getting an A plus grade to being perfect at getting a B plus grade. You know, like you don't need to have an A plus diet. It doesn't exist, first of all. And even if it did, the data is not there to show that that's necessary in order to prevent these diseases that we're all scared of getting. You can still be perfectly healthy by allowing yourself to have sweets every now and then, you know, like be perfect at getting the B plus grade. Like just lowering the bar of our expectation can be so powerful for those who struggle with perfectionism. And then the other thing I was going to say, which I think I might have lost it, but um, oh, is grace. Yeah, and give yourself grace for any time something doesn't go perfectly, because otherwise, like you have an option on how you respond to something that you aren't happy about, whether it's a binge or you emotionally ate or whatever. Like you have two different roads you could go down. You could shame yourself and blame yourself and beat yourself up, which is then going to probably trigger this all or nothing thinking of like, well, I already feel like crap. So I'm going to make myself feel better with food, or I'm just going to enjoy it while it lasts because tomorrow's a new day. Or you can take option B and you can take the different route and give yourself grace and see it for what it is, as I'm a human. This is how I know how to respond to this right now. It's not always going to be like this. I can learn from this, be curious about it, trying to figure out what happened, and then learn and grow and move on from that. And then in that situation, you're not triggering this all or nothing thinking. So those are the two main things. Is like for perfectionism, you really need to figure out what your expectations are and make them realistic. And you can still channel your perfectionistic strength, but change your expectation of yourself. And then also, you need to give yourself grace, whether you're a perfectionist or not, because otherwise, the cycle of self blame is a slippery slope to more self destruction.
Yeah, and grace and self-compassion are something that are so hard for people, but the easiest way that I like to describe what that feels like is just using the example of if your friend came to you with this exact issue, what would you say to them? How would you respond? What would the advice or suggestions be for them? You'd likely give them a lot of compassion and empathy, but
Mm-hmm.
we like to be extremely mean to ourselves most of the time, and that's not
Yeah.
very cool. But two things I wanted to say about what you said about like the perfect diet and about about how that's not necessary. I think so many times people get so involved in thinking about what is the perfect diet for optimal health and optimal this and optimal that. Well, when you start going more towards optimal or perfect in something, other things are going to suffer.
Mm-hmm.
So in the, you know, pursuit of perfect health, what does your social life look like? What does your emotional health look like? What do all of these other things look like? Because if you're trying to achieve optimal health and like you're going to biohack all of these weird things on the internet, like you're likely going to maybe not go out as much. Maybe you're not going to participate in activities or birthday parties because you're avoiding sugar and all of these things. So, yeah, maybe you are in the pursuit of a perfect diet, but your life sucks because
Yeah.
you don't have friends, you aren't, you know, going, you're not having community with people. And I'm pretty sure having a solid community and relationships is a big component of living longer. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly.
and so I think it's just important to remember that are you trying to live till you're 100? Really? Like, is that your goal with your diet? Um, Because
Yeah.
like I was saying, when you start really hyper focusing on one area of something, other things will suffer. And then the second thing I wanted to say about the cycle of the shame and the overeating and the I'll start on Monday situation, a great thing that I like to think of with this cycle is, the saying where it's like if you do the same thing over and over again, expect a different result, the insanity definition, whatever. Um, but like, how can we break that cycle? How can we break the chain? Where can we put the
Mhm.
stop to it? And, rationally, it's easier to think of it rather than when you're emotionally in the depths of, oh, I just binge, like, I'll just restrict tomorrow. But then you forget that that's what perpetuated the binge, maybe in the first place. And
Mhm.
so just, finding somewhere in that chain to break it, whether that's um instead of like, okay, what do you normally do? Can we do the opposite of that? Like instead of skipping
Just see what
breakfast,
happens.
can you just eat breakfast instead and see
Yeah.
what happens?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's important to zoom out and think about like how are these overall patterns serving me or not serving me? And I love what you said about when you're striving to be perfect in one area, it's to the detriment of other areas. And I think what a lot of people need to hear is that that's not necessarily healthy, to have the quote unquote perfect diet if your mental health sucks, and you don't have a social life and you have an eating disorder, that's not healthy. That's actually detrimental to your health.
Right.
So at some point, we can get so extreme that it's like a bell curve, like in the middle, there's like this happy little area where everything's going well. But if you're too extreme on either side, it's not healthy anymore. And it's the opposite of what you're trying to do. So I think a lot of people with perfectionistic tendencies are not seeing that bigger picture,
Yeah.
and they wish they did.
Yeah. Could you share any personal anecdotal stories from your life that um I guess just helped you specifically with overcoming some of these things and being more in tune with your body? What are just some things that you did personally?
Mm, that's a good question. I did find that going through the intuitive eating process is really healing for me to because of my like restricted, like kind of the underlying root of all of my problems was this restrictive mindset. So I needed this permission to not be restrictive, and that's what the intuitive eating process did for me, um, which was helpful. And again, like the environment I was in with the people I was around in college was really helpful, and learning that my body can handle more than I thought it could. So all of these things just helped allow me to let go of my like white knuckled clasp on trying to be super restrictive. Um, I also just think a lot of my issues with my body image, I had body dysmorphia for like as long as I can remember. And sometimes it still kind of like crops up during interesting seasons of my life where there's a lot of stress, or like if I just had a baby and I'm postpartum and my hormones are crazy, it'll kind of pop up again and I have to work through that, which is super fun for me. But a big part of that is that the I felt like I needed to have a certain body in order to be respected. And that's like one of my main character flaws is that I really want to be respected. And I'm working through that all the time. I talk about it all the time with people who mentor me. Like I do not need to be respected by everybody in the world. It's ridiculous to try and, strive for that. But it is a part of my story, and that is a big part of why I tried to change how I looked, because I got messages as a kid that looking a certain way earned you respect from certain people, being my family and peers, and even just the culture, like it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and think about like the kids that were on TV at the time. They were rail thin and everybody wanted to be like them, you know? So I, once I figured that out, that I was utilizing my body as a means to feel respect or earn respect or approval, that was super healing for me and freeing for me to be like, oh, this is why I care so much about this. It's not actually about my body, it's about so much more. And even like being in the relationship that I am with my husband, and like we've been together almost 10 years now, like that was also very healing for me because he's somebody who has unconditionally loved me no matter what I looked like. And he's seen me go through periods of gaining 20 pounds before I was ever even pregnant. And then, of course, the pregnancy weight gain and loss and postpartum. Like, he's seen my body in so many different phases and has never, ever made me feel like I'm not just like the hottest thing in the world, you know? So that's also just like, and I know I'm very lucky to be in that position because there's a lot of women that do not have that. And I don't mean to say that you need to have a man or like your spouse's affections or like obsessions with your body or anything in order to feel better about yours. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. It's just that that was, in a way, kind of healing for me because I needed to see that it didn't really matter what my body looked like. There were still people that would love me and respect me regardless.
Yeah, that's actually really huge and something that I resonate with as well with the body dysmorphia. And you brought up something that I didn't even really think about in a way with the respect. And I think
Mhm.
that's a good way to be curious about what you're feeling too, because like you said, we can put the blame on our bodies for things that don't have anything to do with our
Mhm.
bodies, but they're born out of something that we grew up hearing. Maybe our parents made comments about other people's bodies. And so then we interpret that as, okay, big is bad. I don't want to gain weight. I must be smaller, or else they'll say, "Oh, you're gaining weight," or "You're bigger," and they'll think negatively of that. So that was really
Mhm.
interesting. Did you
Mhm.
did you have to find ways for yourself to like what did you look to then at that point outside of your body to feel respected? Like what were some other ways that you felt respected other than like what you looked like?
I actually didn't necessarily try to replace it. I just let that go. Like, that's a big thing that I'm having to let go of in my story is like I don't need to feel respected by everybody or by even certain people, right? Like, that shouldn't define my quality of life. If there's people that don't respect me, that's going to happen no matter what. So kind of just having a peace of mind about that instead of subconsciously thinking I need that, instead consciously deciding I actually don't need that. And it's been super healing because now I don't really care what I look like in a certain outfit. Like, I wear things that make me feel good. I don't really care what other people think about how I look. Obviously, I have days, but and then on the flip side, like, I don't really care if people don't like what I had to say. And I try to, I still am sensitive to like when I'm an idiot, like, yeah, I'm gonna hold myself accountable to that. Like, I do care about that. But if I feel like I conducted myself well and I did my best and somebody still doesn't like it, there's gonna be a point where I'm like, that is not my problem, and I'm not gonna take that on. So um, yeah, it's been less of like a, okay, I'm gonna replace this and try and feel respected in other ways, and more of a, actually, I'm gonna give myself the freedom to not care about that like I used to, because grand scheme of things, there's more important things to care about.
That's awesome. I bet that was really freeing.
Yeah, it's a work in progress. I have my days.
Yeah, I love that. Something that I like to do at the end of my podcast episodes are I have a question for you that my last guest gave me for you, and then I'm gonna ask you for a question to give.
That's fun. I love that.
So my question from my last guest, they said, out of everything that you've learned from your career, what's one thing you've learned slash a piece of advice you could tell someone to change their life?
Stop trying to be like other people.
Ooh.
There is a lot, like early in my business days, especially when you're trying to do an online business, you see other people that are successful and they can inspire you. And I think that's a good thing and motivate you. But what can happen is that you subconsciously are like, oh, that worked for them. So it'll work for me if I am like that. And the problem with that is that people, I mean, just think about who you like follow on social media. You don't follow somebody, like, just think of anybody because they're similar to somebody else or they're exactly like somebody else. You follow people because of their unique take on things and you like hearing what they have to say. You don't want to hear them say the same exact thing as somebody else
Right.
or look the same way or like even like content. Like just think about content. Like you don't want to look at somebody's content that looks exactly the same as somebody else. And I don't know why that took me a while to realize, but it's like, oh, the more that I have my own spin on things, the better connections I make with people, first of all, because I'm myself, and it's actually like more valued because it's not just like inspo from somebody else. So, but other than like, I'm kind of talking about that from the lens of content, it's true as well of just who you are as a business owner. Like, I think a lot of people get business coaches. I've had 3 different business coaches in my life, and I've had to learn to take what I found helpful for me and ditch the rest from all 3 of those people. And it's very easy to think they're my coach, my business coach. I have to do everything they say to a T. And if I don't do it, or if I'm not like being success or at the level of success that I want, then it's because I didn't follow their method enough, or I didn't follow their advice enough, or I need to ask them another question. And there's a point where you just do have to figure out what works for you and your market and your goals. Like you are your own person. And I think that's actually a strength of yours for everybody. That is a strength, is that you are not copy and paste somebody else. So yeah, that's my answer. That's a really good
A
question.
good answer. That's a good answer. So what is your question then for my next guest?
Who do you usually interview? Is it usually like coaches and professionals?
So yeah, coaches, professionals in the wellness industry usually.
Okay. My question is that an animal?
I
Bring the
don't.
animal into frame. I need to see this. Hi. Hi, little
Look at the
one.
camera. You can do it. Oh, he's like, I don't want to see myself. I feel you. Body
Um,
dysmorphia.
right. Okay, so my question is you'll have to tell me if this has been asked before,
Okay.
but what is the worst piece of advice you've been given about business?
That's a good question. I haven't gotten that question before.
Okay, because they're business owners, right? Usually, or at
Yeah,
least professionals. Like,
yeah. The
okay,
next several I have are either PhDs or dietitians or scientists. So that'll be a good question.
you could rephrase it to be, because maybe they're not a business owner necessarily, they just are a professional. So you could rephrase it to say, like, what's the worst piece of advice you've gotten in your career? So
Mhm.
either way,
Yeah, I like
adjust,
that.
adjust as needed.
Yeah, I love it. Well, can you tell everyone listening where they can find you if they feel like they need help in these areas?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I hang out on Instagram the most. My business is called Yates Nutrition, so that's like my username on any platform. So just wherever you are, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, you can search Yates Nutrition and should be able to find me. But I'm on Instagram the most. That's the best place to get to know me. And I've got lots of free resources. I have my own show. It's called Nourished and Free. You can find it anywhere you listen to your podcast. I like to talk a lot about uh, topics we've touched on today, but also just like dispelling a lot of nutrition myths because a lot of times these things that we think are important, kind of like I've been saying today, aren't. And so we need to dispel those myths so that you can live more nourished and free. So yeah, if you like debunking type episodes and reviews of popular diets, things like that, you'll like my show. And then, yes, I've got like a free quiz. If you struggle with overeating, I've got a quiz for you to figure out why, which you can find in the link in my bio on my socials, or you can just go to my website, yatesnutrition.com. I've got all kinds of stuff, honestly. Just go check out my website and you'll get lost for hours if you want. So, yeah. And if you are specifically feeling like, I know I need support. I know I want somebody walking me through all of these things. My website is a good place to go to check out more about my program, which is also called Nourished and Free. And you can get kind of a feel for what that's about. And you're also welcome to just message me and be like, hey, this is what's going on. This is what I'm looking for. Can you help? And if I can't, I'll point you in the direction of someone who can.
Cool. Is there anything that you wish I would have asked you?
That's a great question. I don't think so, actually. I really don't think so. You've asked a lot of really great questions.
Amazing. Well, I had a great time with our conversation. I feel like we could talk about this stuff all the time. But yeah, it was a good conversation. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me and taking the time to listen to my story and stuff. I have a love-hate relationship with being on podcasts because I feel like I didn't really get to know you at all. Like that's the thing that sucks
That's the
about
point. I get to learn about you and maybe we can talk.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep in touch on socials.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks again. And you guys can, I'll put all of her information in my show notes. But until next time, we will see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Ashley.